Hi everyone. In my last video, I argued against the theory that the Welsh are descended from the ancient Israelites. Now, in response to that, some people said that I was reducing the ancient Britons to mere barbarians. I thought that was a very interesting thing to say though, because that suggests that there was nothing impressive about the documented history of the ancient Britons here in Britain, and that the only way they could be anything other than mere barbarians is if they had some connection to a nation outside of Britain, like the ancient Israelites. And that if you looked simply at the history of the ancient Britons here in Britain, then all you have is a history of mere barbarians. And lots of people have this same idea, that the ancient pre-Roman Britons were mere barbarians, primitive savages, basically. But is that really the case? Is it the case that the Britons, before the Romans arrived, were simply mere primitive savages? Well, let's have a look in this video at three aspects of their society: their warfare, their settlements, and their material culture. So first of all, their warfare. Now, many people, when they imagine the ancient Britons engaging in warfare, such as against the Romans, for example, they imagine just this wild frenzy of people running around with no order to it at all, no kind of strategy, just charging at the enemy mindlessly, basically. But is that really the case? Or did the Britons have a specific method, a not just wild, crazily running around, but a specific method? Well, we know what their method was from Caesar. I mentioned this in a previous video actually, but the Britons, when they engaged in warfare, they made heavy use of chariots. So what they would do is they would drive their chariots into the enemy ranks and try to break up the order of the enemy. Well, for example, with the Romans, they used order in their fighting method extensively. That was a key characteristic of the way in which they engaged in battle. So the Britons would try to break up their ranks by charging around in their chariots, and then there'd be one warrior on the chariot, one driver. So the warrior would jump off, while the charioteer would go out of the would retreat out of the fighting, while the warrior would then engage on foot. When he looked like he was getting overwhelmed, then the charioteer would return, the warrior could jump back on, and then they would retreat until they decided to engage again. So that was a method, and this method is actually essentially the same as what's described in Homer's Iliad, the method used by the Greeks and the Trojans in their battle engagements. And no one says that they're wild savages. So the fact that the Britons had this method, well, the point isn't what the method was. The point is that they had a method. So they weren't just charging into the battlefield like crazy with no kind of actual strategy or anything like that. They weren't. They didn't do that. They had a method, although the method was very different from the one used by the Romans. So secondly, let's look at their settlements. Now again, when you think of the settlements of primitive savages or barbarians, what do you think of? Well, the very word primitive suggests the absence of anything substantial. So when you think of the settlements of primitive savages, you probably think of small settlements with a few huts spread around haphazardly. But is that the case with the settlements of the ancient Britons? Well, in reality, some of their settlements were very impressive indeed. For example, Maiden Castle is actually one of the largest hill forts in not just Britain, but all of Europe. It covers an area of about 47 acres. Now, to put that into perspective, that's only 2 acres less than the Bronze Age city of Akrotiri on Santorini. So that was a Minoan city, and a very prominent one at that. So the fact that that was only 2 acres larger than Maiden Castle in Britain shows that this was a substantial settlement. A settlement that you could compare, as I just did, to Bronze Age cities. So that's not to say that it had the same architecture or anything like that as Bronze Age cities, but it was similar in size. And it had some amazing defensive ramparts and palisades. And in addition, the houses inside the city weren't just haphazardly spread around, but they were arranged in organised rows. So this was an organised, sizable city for the time. In addition, some hill forts actually had massive vertical stone walls around the perimeter, just like the cities of Greece and Rome. Although they weren't necessarily the same architectural style, they were still, in principle, the same thing, massive stone walls, not just dirt ramparts and and wooden palisades. They also had massive vertical stone walls. Although they didn't use them extensively, they did use them. Now thirdly, let's have a look at the material culture of the Britons. Now in particular, let's think about their armour. Now when people think of the ancient Britons fighting against the Romans, well, they sort of think of them in the same way that they think of all of the Celts in general, and they imagine often naked warriors, or warriors wearing very little, no real proper armour. But is that the case? Is that true? Well, maybe some of them engaged in battle like that, but it's known that the ancient Britons used chainmail armour. They also had leather armour. They also even had full metal armour covering their whole torso, just like the ancient Greeks and Romans. So this wasn't used as extensively as the Greeks and Romans used it, but they did have it, and they did use it. We can also say similar things about their swords, their shields, and other pieces of engineering as well. You can see some examples on the screen. These are absolutely amazing pieces of design. It's not the work of primitive savages, is it? In fact, the metalworking of the ancient Britons, and the Gauls in France as well, is renowned by modern scholars for how amazing it is. Their metalworking was fantastic. So in summary, we see that the ancient Britons didn't just charge into battle without any consideration for tactics or anything like that. They had a method which they used. In addition, we've seen that their settlements, some of their settlements were incredibly large, comparable to some Bronze Age cities, and they had enormous defensive walls, some of them even using large stone walls as well. And we've also seen that their material culture was also not the work of primitive savages, but was the work of people who could create very impressive works of metal with gold, bronze, and other metals as well. So the ancient Britons weren't mere savages, wild, primitive barbarians. They did have their own impressive culture in many ways. Now, this isn't a competition. The study of ancient civilizations is not about putting one nation against the other and seeing which was better. The point is that they had their different ways of doing things, and the Britons are impressive in their own right, in their own ways, their own unique ways of doing things. So although they may not have done things in the same way as the ancient Romans or Greeks, for example, that doesn't make them wild savages. But at the same time, let's remember it's not a competition.